Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Facts and Fallacies podcast. My name is Cameron English, your host as always, joined again by Dr. Liza Dunn. Liza, it's very nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am so excited. It's Father's Day season, so happy Father's Day to all you dads out there. I call it second birthday because it's an excuse to buy myself little gifts. So have a good time. Hope you can get yourself something special. Spend some time with your families. It's always great. I have a special place for it now that I have a kid. So there you go.
Yeah. Happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. You're the best.
Aw, shucks. We thank you collectively. All right, so we've got 3 stories to talk about as usual, and we've been leaning heavy on the medicine side lately, given our excellent guest host. But we're going to dive back into some agriculture topics, and it's some pretty pressing stuff that's been in the news lately. So let's jump right into these. So first up, France sugar beet production hits 14-year low, and experts are blaming a pesticide ban in France, neonicotinoids, which we'll talk more about. Next up, organic is good. Greenwashing propagated by advocacy groups and marketing savvy green industry players. Again, this is a topic that's well worn for us, but again, it's important to dive into this as long as it's in the news. And then finally, the politics of farming affects every American. Here's why agriculture will be the next presidential election. So this first story we're talking about, this is from Reuters. And originally from Reuters, I should say, GLP reprinted it. And here they're talking about sugar production in France because sugar comes from just a handful of sources. One of them is sugar beets. And in the European Union more generally, but specifically in France, they're having a problem. Part of it is the weather. It's been, I believe it's been abnormally wet, which causes delays in planting. But also across the European Union, there's been a ban on a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. And Liza can speak more to these, but the basic is that they are seed coatings that you put on a variety of different crop seeds. You plant them, and then as the plant or the crop grows, it has a little bit of this insecticide all throughout the plant. So if it gets attacked, the insect dies. Now, the environmental groups, all of our friends that we talk about all the time on the show, they don't like these chemicals. And it's a strange situation because they are, as far as anybody knows, the research I've looked at anyway, is that they pose lower risk to the environment. They're not a threat to human health. And they are in many ways a step up in terms of sustainability compared to their predecessors. But the activist groups have banned these, and farmers the whole time have said, please don't do this. You're going to make our jobs harder. You have scientists saying, please don't do this. You're going to make the farmers' jobs harder. There's risk of price inflation and not food shortages in the sense of like people are going to go hungry just yet, but it's going to have a noticeable effect on consumers. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with the situation in France. Now, of course, Reuters here is trying to be objective and balanced in how they report this, but I would be very curious to hear from the farmers in France and from the people who are being affected by this, because my suspicion is they are going to be a little more aggressive in how they analyze the situation. So, Liza, jump in here. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that it's really unfortunate because once again, farmers are being denied a tool that really, really actually helps decrease food prices, right? So neonicotinoids are very, very well studied. There are all sorts of mitigation. They're regulated. There's all sorts of mitigation put around how they're applied. And with seed coating, you're actually not spraying it all over the plant, right? Mm-hmm. So it minimizes the exposure to bees and other insects that are at risk, right? And so we try to mitigate that risk in order to make the farmer as productive as possible and decrease the risk of exposure to off-target insects as much as possible. Now, the insects that we're feeding on sugar beets carry viruses, like especially the yellow virus, which was responsible for a 30% loss in sugar beets in, I want to say, 2020, just a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it really, really devastated farmers who were planting this. Now, remember, sugar is a staple product. It's not one of those things that are sort of by the wayside. It's used in a lot of different things. And if sugar prices increase because you have a decrease in production or a decrease in yield, and topped off with a decrease in production because of weather situation in France, and farmers being very, very concerned about planting this particular crop because of the devastating effect that insects had on it 20 years ago. The offset in the price goes up, so that normally would be an incentive to plant because you would get more money for your yield. But this year, it's kind of a funny dynamic given the absolute devastation that they faced in 2020, plus the adverse weather conditions, makes it unlikely for farmers to really, in Europe, to want to use this as a crop. And that it has a knock-on effect for high prices for consumers. And once again, food security, even though Europe tends to be a little bit more food secure than some other places in the world, this actually harms the most vulnerable people in Europe.
Sure. And I think the variables are the same. So the magnitude of the policy may not be as severe yet. It could very well be in the future. But I think the illustration is when you ban products that farmers need and that pose minimal risk to human health, and we can talk about insects in a second. When you eliminate these tools, there is suffering. Now that exists on a spectrum, and it's not always catastrophic, but you never know, right? A worse turn in the weather, and again, people are always talking about climate change here. So, right, you could have a situation where the conditions are right, and then you don't have access to these chemicals, and then you have a real problem on your hands. But let's talk about the bees and bees and so forth, right? This is the go-to, right? This is the zinger, is that you're killing the bees. And fill in the gaps here. But my understanding is that when they do studies to see if neonicotinoids hurt bees, they do what are called caged bee studies, where effectively they just douse these poor little bees with these chemicals. And they go, look, we gave them like 5,000 times what's allowable, and they got really sick, or they, it screwed with their sense of direction, or they got lethargic, and that kills the bees. And then the press release goes out, the press picks it up. Insecticides kill bees, but when you do better designed studies where you're actually replicating field conditions, or at least approximating them, what you find is that the bees are actually not exposed to significant amounts of neonicotinoids. And with sugar beets in particular, they're not flowering plants, which I feel like that's a key detail that consumers need to be made aware of when you're telling them about the dangers of these pesticides.
Exactly. And so one of the nice things about seed treatments is that it's the seed treatment. The seed is the part of the plant that has the most potential. And so what you want to do, because it's the thing that's going to sort of grow, right? So you want to protect it at its most vulnerable. And remember, since plants can't run away from you, they actually protect their seeds too with natural insecticides, right? That they make on their own. So plants will often make, cyanogenic compounds and things like that to protect their seeds. So like if you think of peach pits and apple pits and apple seeds, they have compounds in them that can be metabolized into cyanide, components. Those are naturally occurring pesticides. So neonics, though, are designed to really protect the plant. These seed treatments are designed to protect the plant when they're underground. And so the bees aren't going to be, flying around and getting access to them, especially because of the flowering situation as well. So they're protecting the plants from the seeds from predation, from the actual predators that go for the beet itself, as opposed to randomly getting onto bees from for crops that depend on bees for pollination and things like that. So I think it's unfair. It's unfortunate that farmers have been denied this particular treatment. And I think that the food situation in Europe is precarious enough with the situation in Ukraine that they need to be thinking creatively about the most productive ways of ensuring a high quality food supply with high quality crop protection products, which are regulated in order to mitigate the off target effects and studied. Yes, they do study all sorts of ways to prevent bees from being exposed and things like that. Now, I'm not a beekeeper or a bee expert by any stretch of the imagination. What I do know is that neonics work in a way that they are not with the trace exposures that humans get. They aren't going to cause harm in human consumption or anything like that when they're applied on a crop. So residues that you might get are not going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. And I'll just add, as we've said multiple times in recent weeks, agriculture is the foundation of civilization. Farmers aren't going anywhere. These crops aren't going anywhere. And more important for our purposes here, pesticides aren't going anywhere. They're going to have to use something to try to control these insects. And what they're going to go to, and these are still important chemicals, I'm not here to bash them, but I believe pyrethrins are the next in line for controlling insects. And those are manageable, but their toxicity profile is a little bit higher than that of neonicotinoids, right?
And it's just different too. And they're regulated as well. Since they're regulated, they're not going to cause out, they're going to be regulated to make sure they don't have off-target effects, that the residue levels won't be too high or anything like that. But the interesting thing about pyrethrins, which are naturally occurring chemicals that plants make. So they were discovered in 400 BC. The Persians discovered that these certain chrysanthemums had insecticidal properties, and they sold Persian powder to militaries for centuries until they discovered that it was this chemical, these pyrethrins, that worked on the sodium channels in the nerves of insects and paralyzed them. And then we don't have those same sodium channels, so they don't tend to bother us. So when people figured out what that naturally occurring chemical was, they made an analog of it, made it a little bit more light, stable, and made it a little bit less allergenic. And that actually became pyrethroids. And those are, first line insecticides for a lot of different public health. So in malaria campaigns and in, crop protection kind of things. So they're very, very important kinds of chemicals for both people and plants. Now, once again, neonics is, those particular, that chemistry works on what we call nicotinic receptors. And we have nicotinic receptors that help move our muscles, right? And if you block those nicotinic receptors that help move your muscles, you get paralyzed. But our nicotinic receptors are very different than insect nicotinic receptors. So once again, very low toxicity, made sort of because of the neonics are made because of our understanding of how different chemistries work in different organisms, that you can tailor them to specific nicotinic receptors, and the insects will get paralyzed, but people and animals won't get paralyzed. And these are such interesting chemistries that theoretically you could use these chemistries in anti-malarial campaigns instead of things like DDT. So DDT is currently put on the walls in some places in South Africa because of insecticide resistant mosquitoes, and you could theoretically do that with neonics instead, and have a much lower kind of environmental impact with neonics instead of something like DDT. And a lot of tropical medicine people talk about the potential for these particular insecticides to, help in, multi-insecticide resistant insect control for a public health purpose as well as not just crops. And it's a shame that neonics has gotten this gotten sort of targeted because they are very important and very well designed insecticides that are critical for crops and also could be critical for public health.
The most frustrating part of this is that it's a great example we're going to talk about in our next story, which is greenwashing, because the activist groups, they sell the message of, banning neonics, ban any pesticide, really. They say, right, these are harmful to the environment. We need to get rid of as many of these as possible. And then they're also against biotech solutions. So like with gene editing, British Sugar, which is a major sugar producer in the UK, they have developed a virus yellows resistant sugar beet. Now, I believe as things improve in the UK, that might earn authorization for actual commercial use. So that would be a big deal. But France is in the European Union, so I don't know if they would have access to that just yet. But
right.
The point is that you have multiple solutions, right? So if you're concerned about pesticide use, you want multiple chemistries available so farmers have a choice in what's going to work best under their growing conditions. And if you want even less pesticide use, you want these biotechnologies on the market, because then you're attacking the problem from multiple angles. You're reducing the resistance issue. You're reducing the dependence on a single chemistry. And all the while that the people who are pushing for these restrictions are selling their message under the banner of let's farm green, let's be sustainable. It's just, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, Liza.
Yeah, no, and it's frustrating because, once again, we have 10,000 years of experience with organic farming. Nothing's particularly wrong with organic farming. It just doesn't reliably feed people. And we need much more land and much than we have to be able to reliably feed people, especially with the growing population. And hungry people are not good stewards of the environment. They will do everything that they can to feed themselves. So I think it's really, really unfortunate that you're taking these innovative ideas that are really important solutions to problems that farmers have, that are invented by unbelievably brilliant scientists that really are there to help people. They want to help people, and for every single advance that they've made, they meet with this whole, well, we need to go back to Mother Nature. Well, Mother Nature is all about survival of the fittest. And that's why 99% of the pesticides you eat are naturally occurring, coming from plants to defend themselves. So it's really important to think about this critically and help people make the best decisions that they can about how to adequately grow enough food for 10 billion people without destroying the planet. And that's what these solutions are geared to do. And we need to really think about food security in that context. The companies aren't out there to harm people. That's a bad business model, right? So the things like neonics and pyrethroids and other synthetic pesticides are actually very, very important. And tested and regulated and regulated to make sure that they don't have undue environmental impacts and undue health impacts. So the farmers need to use all of the tools at their disposal to make the most efficient farming available to the most people in the world.
Well, let's move into our second story. That's a great transition. And I think what this story illustrates, and this may be controversial for some folks, but it's industry that drives sustainability and that really drives innovation. I don't have to convince you of that, but there's some people listening who are gonna object to that. I think just reflexively, people hear industry and their antenna goes up. They're like, I don't know about that. So let me explain what I mean here. Here we're talking about a story by Dr. David Zarek. This was published on his blog originally called The Riskmonger, and GLP republished it. It's called Organic is Good, Greenwashing Propagated by Environmental Advocacy Group Lobbyists in Marketing Savvy Green Industry. Now, what he's talking about here is I believe it's some draft legislation in Europe. I'm not sure it's been passed yet, but they're proposing some rules that would regulate the marketing claims that companies can make about their products. Now, this can be a problem if you go into a grocery store or Walmart or any kind of consumer goods store. You will see all sorts of products with sustainability labels or eco-friendly labels. We'll get into some in a minute. Yeah, health, right? There are all these kind of labels, and they'll say, made from 100% recycled, whatever, or, carbon neutral. Like, there's all sorts of these marketing labels that may or may not be reliable. So the European Union is trying to deal with this by clamping down on clamping down on what industries can say about their products. Now, Zarek's point here is that this needs to apply equally well to governments themselves and to activist groups, because they're making all sorts of fallacious claims about sustainability. The only difference is the product they're selling is their advocacy, or if they're politicians, they're selling themselves. They're selling their position in office, right? Vote for me and I'll save the world. And the ultimate point he's driving at here is that these groups, these politicians, they're hypocrites. It's not really about sustainability. And maybe David probably has his own thoughts on this, but my assessment here would be these groups have specific outcomes in mind. Like I said last week, it's degrowth, right? They are not sustainability minded. They are anti-technology minded. They want fewer people consuming fewer products and services, because that's the end goal for them. It's not about how do we, as you said a minute ago, how do we feed people as the population expands, or as people get wealthier and they demand more food and they demand higher standards of living. It's about let's get fewer people and let's get them to use less stuff. And David goes through multiple examples, and we can get into some of them. And he talks about the hypocrisy and frankly delusional claims that some of these groups make and some of these politicians make, and they get away with it because they are the ones running the discussion and passing the laws. And again, we'll talk about some ways we can push back on that and how that has been successful. But I'll stop jumping here. What was your take on this story?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And one of the things that I've seen on both the right and the left, and just sort of in academia and in lots of different circles, is that this fundamental distrust of industry. And unfortunately, industry is held at arm's length for many, many different groups. And we're discouraged from having a voice at the table, even though people in academic situations, for example, will have a really great scientific idea that they want to get out to the public in terms of a drug, or in terms of a chemistry that helps plants, or in terms of a genetic modification of something. A lot of those things happen in academia, and because of the regulatory apparatus that's often put around these things, that's always put around these things, academia and small companies have a very hard time keeping up with the cost of those regulations. Now, I'm not saying things shouldn't be regulated, but what I'm saying is that companies are experts at really getting great innovative ideas off of a shelf and doing all the necessary testing and all the necessary legwork to get those products out to benefit the biggest part of the population. And the population, if they didn't want these things, they don't buy these things. Now, what happens is with a lot of these different organizations, activist organizations, is that they scare people about science. And so on the back end, they put a lot of pressure on the consumers not to buy things that they deem to be somehow harmful. And they'll do lots of different labeling campaigns. For example, they'll label, the non-GMO butterfly label that you'll see on lots and lots of products in grocery stores in the United States. They'll claim that they're doing that just to inform people that this is, it doesn't have genetic modification in the technology that was used to produce this product. Well, they will label. So there are 10 GMOs in the United States that are on the market, right? And there are over 57,000 products labeled. Many of those products do not have DNA. And so if they do not have DNA, there's not a reason to be labeling them as non-GMO, for example, non-GMO water or non-GMO salts. And what those labels do is they actually increase the price for the customer. So it's actually not a really great way to inform a customer of anything. It makes people fearful of their food, and it is a business on its own. And so it's not a transparent transparent way of doing business by making everybody scared about things. And it really is anti-science to make these claims and then scare people, and then people choose a less environmentally friendly way of producing food. It also raises prices, and then once again, that affects the most poor people who are least resilient. So, I mean, The Lancet even talks about in one of its issues in planetary kind of health and food and its discussion. They even talk about how things should be really strictly regulated to the point where you really should ban pesticides and you should ban different advances in agriculture. And they say, quote unquote, and I can get you the article, they say, quote unquote, this may cause food prices to rise. Well, it's completely unscientific to make food prices rise for vulnerable people. And then also, it's not just either. If we're going to talk about social justice, you should be not making food prices rise for the most vulnerable people. And you should be using the most advanced scientific techniques that are tested to make sure that they aren't impacting the environment and they aren't impacting public health. And that's the reverse of what's happening in a lot of these situations. And I think that many public health officials and many doctors think that they're doing the right thing by advocating for organic farming. But once again, we've got 50 years of food security in the West and 10,000 years of experience with organic farming. And the environment can't support that. And it's not fair to ask other people to pay higher prices for food when you in the West, we in the West, we can absorb that. A lot of us, not all of us, but in developing countries, that's not fair. And scientists in developing countries, like, for example, Lina Tripathi, who's a brilliant African scientist, has developed a GMO banana that is resistant to banana wilt, which affects subsistence farmers in Uganda. And banana is a staple food. She has had an incredibly difficult time getting that technology out to those subsistence farmers. Her own technology that's not driven by a company, and it can benefit the women and children. She's not able to get that out because of the activism against scientific advances in agriculture, and it's really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to dive into there. Before we move on, though, I want to plug this book by Henry Hazlitt. It's called Economics in One Lesson. It's really old. You can get a sexy hardcover like I have, or you can read it for free online. But you made some comments about what consumers want and why companies pursue the innovations they do. And the answer is, as uncomfortable as makes some people get, is it's the profit motive. And the one lesson that Hazlitt stresses in every chapter of the book is you have to look at the unseen effects of a policy. And you just gave several great examples of that, right? So when Europe enacts these restrictions, for example, we're going to cut pesticide use by 50% and we're going to hike organic production 25%. That makes them feel good and it sounds really good. But really what you're doing, and there's been studies that have actually confirmed this, you are exporting your agricultural production to other parts of the world where these restrictions are not in place. That means that farmers in other parts of the world have to use more pesticides and they have to grow or they have to cultivate more land. So in other words, you're not eliminating the environmental impacts of using the technologies that you say are bad for the planet. You're just making other people engage in them, right? So on balance, the net effect is more pollution, right? More pesticide use. Same thing with the labeling issue. You talked about the non-GMO labels, and individual companies are starting to come up with their own. And funny enough, they're being sued by Non-GMO Project and some of these other groups for not going through the certification process. So You have people, wasting money on lawsuits. You have consumers paying more for food. But now we have these USDA bioengineered food labels. These, and I'm not making this up, you can go look up the USDA studies on this. This costs us already billions of dollars to put these labels on foods. Some that are made from genetically engineered ingredients, some that may or may not be. But the USDA says there is no net benefit to the consumer for these labels. And the reason is, as they well know, as everybody in the field well knows, there's nothing wrong with growing genetically engineered crops. But then you get some absurdities too. So Dr. Henry Miller has made the point in multiple articles that you could have two identical bottles of corn oil that come from the same field, same label, same processing, everything. One of them could have this bioengineered label and one could not. And the only reason is the law does not mandate the label on products that are made from but don't necessarily contain genetically engineered ingredients. Now, oil is fat, right? So there's no DNA in that. So so one company that sells corn oil could say, well, we'll put the label on it. What the hell? You have another company that says there's no point in putting the label. So in other words, you have this label that's supposed to inform consumers, but it is inherently confusing because the law is ridiculous. And just to go back to Hazlitt's book, this is what we're talking about. You get all of these nonsensical policies that cause environmental harm, they cause food prices to rise, they cause confusion, and it's all because of this greenwashing foolishness.
That's right. That's right. And I think, once again, it's very important to engage with industry to understand how important their role is in society for being able to bring to market at scale products that people actually need, that have made us have the most extraordinary abundance since the 20th century. It's just incredible how much we've achieved scientifically, and how much we've been able to, how much comfort we live in the West because of these scientific advances. And industry has been really fundamental to that success. And so I would encourage people to maybe reevaluate how important industry is to those contributions and try to engage with people from industry a little bit more. Understand that, yes, there are products that people want to sell, but there are products that NGOs want to sell, and there are products that, this label is a product that people are selling as well. And so understand that there are bias. Everybody's got biases. Everybody's got conflicts. But without engaging and trying to understand how impactful industry has been on the quality of life for people in the West, and how industry has really helped elevate people in developing countries too, once they've been able to create their own industries and use their own innovations and things like that, that can really help lift people out of poverty, because at the end of the day, they provide jobs, they provide products that people want, they provide, quality of life. Mm-hmm. So, prior to the 20th century, people lived, to the ripe old age of 35 and 45. Mm-hmm. And because we've made these advances and because we've been able to scale up that technology, we've really been able to make life a lot more comfortable for people. And so comfortable people have forgotten what it's like to be a subsistence farmer, and what it's like to not have access to medicines, and what it's like to, die of infectious diseases and starvation. So I think that we need to really think critically before we make poor decisions. Same thing goes with energy. David Zaruk was talking about, the nuclear energy that is carbon free. And we are not thinking about that critically enough in terms of, supplying people with a constant electricity supply. The reason why we can do this conversation over the internet is because we've got abundant electricity. And we need to think about how we produce that. And we need to think about how we, get our food from farms onto, to people, to the supermarket. It doesn't just sort of happen magically. And we've lost sight of that. And I think it's really unfortunate. And there's, a lot of romanticization of what the past was like. Mm-hmm. And I think people are mistaken in that romance.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to live a paleo lifestyle, just go find a forest somewhere, dig the bugs out of the ground and sleep in the trees. Hope you don't die of exposure, right? You can live that way. You can have that green paradise right now. I don't want that. I don't want it for my family or my friends. I like electricity. I have AC on right now. It's California out here in the summertime. It sucks. I don't I don't want to be here if I don't have these amenities. It's just, and of course, it's just my comfort that I'm talking about here. But there are people, and I think you've made this point too, right? People on ventilators or people who are in hospitals, right? Their existence is dependent upon a steady flow of electricity or access to relatively inexpensive medicines or consumer products, like blister packs that keep pills from or medicines from spoiling or whatever, right? These are essential products. And it may make you feel good to go, yeah, we're going to ban plastic,
But plastic prevents food waste, and you can recycle plastic.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's so important. I mean, if you, David was mentioning in his article, I can have a cucumber. It'll last me 10 days if it's got plastic. It lasts me 2 if it doesn't. So if you really want to mitigate food waste and things like that, there are advances that we need to keep on. I think we need to innovate to make things better and better, right? I think we can continue to do that. But having this romantic notion of the past as if it were some golden age of agriculture and human existence is really driving people to make poor policy decisions.
Sure. And one other point he makes related to plastic that I always find helpful to point out to people is that we forget about the value of plastics until, one, we get sick and we need blood transfusions, right? What's that stored in?
Yeah.
Plastic bags. Or when you have a pandemic, all of a sudden everybody gets the value of plastic. CNN's not running stories about pollution caused by masking and so
forth.
Or
syringes, right?
Right. And again, this is not about the pandemic. My point is that everybody very clearly understood the value of these products on a dime. That's all it took was some nasty virus going around. So there's two sides to the equation, as always. I think that's what you need to keep in mind. That's the takeaway from his story here. And again, this final story, this is by Bill Wirtz, and he's writing for the Boston Herald originally. And for the reasons we've been discussing, and some interesting ones that we'll also talk about, he's pointing out that agriculture really is a central issue for all of us. And it's poised to become a very important political issue, both in the United States and in the European Union. And one of the things he says is that you have the restrictions that we've been talking about that are putting pressure on farmers, they're putting pressure on industry, they're raising food prices. Now, one of the ways governments have tried to combat this, amusingly enough, using legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, is causing more inflation to give farmers loans, to give them subsidies to bolster their businesses, which are being hurt by regulations that the same governments are putting in place. So Wirtz makes the point that this only goes so far, right? You can give billions, $1 billion here, $500,000 or $500 million here, whatever. You can bolster agriculture in this way, but that has limits. Because ultimately, the solution, as we've been talking about, is increased production, increased sustainability, increased innovation, right? You can't just throw money at a problem or pass a law because that's just a piece of paper. Piece of papers don't do anything unless people adhere to them or they change their behavior in response to them. So there's a few things we can get into here, but the key point that he makes is that in Europe, they're called the European People's Party, the EPP. They're the largest political group in the European Parliament. And he talks about how they have come out and said, after all this wrangling about the Green Deal and reducing pesticide use, they've just come out and they've said, we reject this idea that we're going to cut pesticide use by 50%, because they are seeing farmers and they're seeing consumers who are being impacted by this in Europe and around the world. We talked about Sri Lanka last week. And they recognize that there's a lot of suffering on the table if we push these policies forward. And so and this is a positive in my mind. This is people waking up and going, wow, life's going to get that much harder for me and my family if I don't say something about this. So I think that's encouraging. But the point he's making is like, this is central to your life, right? Everyone has to eat every day. If you go too long without food, things start to go wrong really, really quickly.
People get hangry.
Yeah. Just ask my wife. I love my wife, in case she ever watches this. She's the best. But in any event, yes, it's agriculture central to our lives. And as people see the fallout from some of these policies, it's increasingly going to become an important political issue.
And it is becoming a more and more important political issue. Once again, a lot of people think that, oh, agriculture kind of boring. It's a bunch of country bumpkins with a little straw hat and piece of straw out of their mouth, and they're doing things willy-nilly without any kind of, not understanding that farmers are very, very savvy business people. They're very, very good at it. They've got the perfect mixture of science, because they've got to have healthy soil in order to grow their healthy crops, in order to feed, to pay for what they're growing, right? They need to make a profit in order to, so the business people as well, in order to regrow their next crop next time. So they've got to fall into all of the regulatory requirements that allows them to put their crop on the market. They have to make enough to feed themselves and their families, and then the rest goes to make the food prices go down for the rest of the world. They want to grow healthy, productive crops for the most number of people, and they're so good at it that 2% of our population farms, and they feed the rest of us and export in the United States anyway, at least close to 25% of what else they make. So they are critical for food security. Never before, once again, has that happened in the history of mankind. In 1900, 45% of us farmed, and we were nowhere near as productive, and nowhere near as had nowhere near as of an abundance of food. So I think that it's really, really important that to understand what this tiny segment of the population does for the rest of us and for humanity, and really, really appreciate it. I'm trying to remember, I think it's Eric Sannard has this quote on a TED Talk that says, without farmers, we'd all be hungry, naked, and sober. And that is very, very true. So we forget how much, how significant of an impact that they have in our lives. Now, you're hearing more and more in the EU, especially with the Dutch farmer situation. You're hearing John Kerry in the United States talking about how farmers need to cut emissions, and agriculture is so responsible for so many emissions, and this is terrible for the planet and all of this kind of stuff. What they're forgetting is that, so for example, the Dutch farmers, the claim is that they use too much nitrogen fertilizer, and the cattle production, nitrogen and methane production is really, needs to go down. So because methane and nitrogen are potent greenhouse gases and cause, pollution and contaminate water and all of that kind of stuff. So the large claim is that they need to cut these down dramatically. If you were to take Dutch greenhouse gas emissions completely off, right? If you were to close down the whole country, everybody stopped driving, they stopped cattle farming, they stopped using fertilizer, if they did everything, they would cut down on greenhouse gas emissions by something like 0.357% for the whole world. It would be absolutely meaningless. And they are such a productive country that you would really impact their economy. You would impact their food supply. They are. I've read that they are the second largest producer of agriculture globally after the United States. And you're talking about a country that's got 18 million people in it. It's a tiny country. And if you shut it all down, you do not impact the overall greenhouse gas emission, but you do impact a huge segment of the population in terms of food security, and you take down their economy. Mm-hmm. You can say the same for most of the countries in Europe. If they each one did, took out everything, they'd have hardly any impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think it's really important that, once again, these advances in agriculture also help decrease greenhouse gas emissions, right? If you use, genetic technology to grow your plants, you don't have to take diesel, spray using diesel tractors or anything like that over and over. You don't have, if you use, herbicides effectively. You don't have to till the soil, right? And the soil can be a carbon sink that way, and you don't lose your topsoil that way, and you're not driving a tractor back and forth over getting your weeds and stuff like that. So the products that we make and the advances in agriculture are so important for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions that this notion that you're somehow going to save the world by going back in time, once again, is greenwashing, and it's not productive.
Yeah, it's jackassery, just to make up a word, I think. The problem broadly, and what you said about the Netherlands is true, of course, but it's true of just about every industrialized nation. We're productive agriculturally speaking, but our emissions are low, and that's because of technological innovation. And there's all sorts of cool stuff going on. Dr. Frank Mitloehner has done really great work on this. He talks about how in California, because he's just down the road from me, interestingly enough, they take methane emissions from animal manure and they filter it and they use it to power their farms, right? Because methane, as we've all been told ad nauseum, is a powerful greenhouse gas. So they pump it out of these poop lagoons, basically, and they reprocess it as energy. That's incredible. And then, of course,
recycle.
Yes, yeah, right. That's as green as it gets. Now, interestingly, when you Google Dr. Mitloehner's name, you'll see his UC Davis page, and you'll see a bunch of slanderous, dishonest articles by liars, and I have no problem saying that. You're liars for attacking this guy, who accused him of being an industry shill and downplaying the effects of climate change, which, of course, is kind of stupid when you think about it, because what did I just say, right? He's talking about recycling methane for energy. And then you have cattle breeds that can tolerate heat better, which means they can produce more because they're healthy. You have veterinary medicine improvements. You have feed that is like per unit of feed, it sustains the animal longer.
And it's not contaminated with mycotoxins, and it's all sorts of benefits that come from that.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, and I spoke to, her name escapes me, but I spoke to a veterinarian on this podcast a while back, and she was telling me that a lot of barns now are air conditioned, and they have technology that will self-milk the cows. Like when the cows are ready to be milked, they walk up to the machine and it milks them. And they're living in these cool conditions, not relatively cool, right? It's not like your front room, but air conditioned essentially. You know what I mean? So you have all of these cool technologies, and these are designed, and stay with me here, everyone, to keep the animals healthy, because healthy animals, just like healthy crops, produce more. So again, the industry has the incentive to do the thing that everyone lectures them about doing, and they're doing it, and they're being prevented from accelerating those projects by these activist groups and by the politicians that listen to them. I don't know. I can't. How many times can you say it? Yeah.
It's really, really frustrating. It's really frustrating. Yeah. But I do think that the Dutch farmers they've had a watershed moment with the election of that party, and I think that hopefully some common sense will prevail, because I think Europe is at extraordinary risk of really losing its food independence. You know, with a couple years ago. So rape is a plant that's like canola. It's just slightly genetically different, right? So France is a big producer of rape, and they round up, because of the restrictions placed on farmers. They weren't able to meet the demand of the population, and they had to go to Ukraine to get Ukrainian supply of that crop, and they depleted the entire Ukrainian crop. And now Ukraine's offline in terms of agriculture. So countries that depend on it can't even get it. So it's really demonstrative of how important good agricultural policy is. And I hope that politicians, and I hope that the media will get more interested in the nuanced argument about this, because everybody's got to eat. And it's really important to make good policy.
Yes. If I can just make one modification, let's start with not writing bad stuff. All you folks out there, the George Monbiot's of the world. And just stop writing about agriculture, and let's start there. Once you clean up your act, you start writing about something else. Then come back and after you've learned something. But
talk to experts in agriculture. Talk to people who are, I wouldn't necessarily just talk to physicians about agriculture. Physicians are on this concern that there's, excess heart disease, excess obesity, hypertension, cancer, and those things. And they're concerned about them because they're seeing more of it. But that's because those are diseases of aging. And we do need to address those things, but physicians shouldn't be necessarily weighing in on agriculture unless they've had some experience with it, right? So let's try to talk to people who are experts in their fields, and try to, understand the nuances behind this and why we do the things we do. And I think it's really important for us to start trying to rebuild trust in industry and in academia, and because we're all in this together. We all want the same things for our children. We want healthy food, good education, a quality of life that is accessible to people, right? And so it's really important to listen to experts in all of these fields, and try to make the best policy decisions possible.
Well said. Well said. I think that's a good place to end for the week. A lot of brain food to take away. Just think about this stuff and read these articles and let it soak in. I think our audience is pretty well informed about this, so share it with your friends, right? Retweet the episode when it comes out. Share it. I got a haircut earlier, and I was like, "Hey, I do this podcast, and I talked to this doctor." She's like, "Oh, really? That's interesting." Got to talk about the dirty dozen and how stupid it is, and she's like, "Wow, I used to be really scared of growth hormones in milk and." And it's like, because I do this, I was like, no, don't worry about that. That's stupid. She's like, okay, I'm going to buy milk now.
Yes, that's exactly. These people use chemicals all day long. They use hair stuff, and they know that they can use them safely with, they're not going to be spraying them in their mouths, or, you know what I mean? So artists use, paint and stripper and thinner and all sorts of stuff that's got loaded with chemicals. Chemistry makes your life better.
Yes.
So it's really important.
It does. Absolutely. There's so much we could say. I'm gonna let you guys go so you can enjoy the rest of your week. Follow us on Twitter in the meantime at Dr. Liza Dunn, MD, at Cam J English, at Genetic Literacy on Twitter for the Genetic Literacy Project, at Kevin Folta, who's off enjoying, spending time with his new daughter. So with that, we will see you next week. Have a great Father's Day again. Until next time.
Happy Father's Day.